Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Let's first begin by acknowledging that McGill University is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which we gather today. So it's my pleasure today to welcome all of you to this fireside chat, Perspectives on a Sustainable Economy, with Mitch McEwen. I'm Sanjith Gopalakrishnan, Director of the Sustainable Growth Initiative at Desautels. It's a cross-faculty venture that is housed at the Desautels Faculty of Management, but aims to mobilize academics, students across the university, as well as industry and policy leaders, in order to facilitate a transition towards a sustainable economy. And SGI would not be possible if not for our partners and donors, and their contributions enable us to develop innovative solutions as well as offer activities such as the one today. And on that note, a big thank you to CIBC, Power Sustainable, CDPQ, and Alstom. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Ashley, as well as Carolyn, and Lynn, as well as Ireland from the Alumni Engagement Office, without whom this event would not be possible. So today we have with us Mitch McEwen, and Mitch is the Senior Manager of Sustainable Finance Strategy and Commercialization at TD, where he has had the opportunity over the past 5 years to lead Change the Bank projects focused on sustainability. These include the bank's $500 billion sustainable and decarbonization finance target. He was named the Green Banker by Corporate Knights, as well as in 2024, the top 30 under 30 in sustainability in Canada, for his role in helping influence the financial services sector. Mitch, happily for us, is a proud McGill alumnus and is also based in Montreal. Thank you very much, Mitch, for joining us today, and thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us today.
It's really great to be here, Sanjith. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Mitch. So first, let's begin with your story and your journey. Could you speak to your journey in the space of sustainable finance and what has brought you here?
Absolutely. So for me, my journey actually originated during undergrad. My honest intention was to pursue a career in investment banking, but I had the opportunity to actually live abroad in the UK for about a year or so. And at the time, the Paris Agreement was actually being signed, which was a really pivotal piece of global cooperation around climate. And at that moment, being from Canada, and probably wasn't much of a perspective for many people living here, given that we're a resource-based economy, there was a huge opportunity that kind of passed in my mind for that intersection between finance and sustainability. Fast forward coming back to Canada, I had lots of questions about the intersection between finance and how it could really play a role in driving positive change. So that's why I actually ended up coming to McGill. I had the opportunity to be our Sustainability Officer at Desautels Capital Management for the Socially Responsible Investing Fund. Gave presentations in Montreal, Toronto, and New York pitching the fund, and then ultimately landed my internship at TD. I was actually one of the first 5 or so people focused on sustainable strategy at TD and helped with our various commitments over the years. Fast forwarding 5 years today, I have the pleasure of leading our sustainable finance strategy and commercialization work, and as you mentioned, notably our $500 billion by 2030 sustainable and decarbonization finance target.
Excellent. So for the uninitiated amongst us, could you describe what your role typically entails on a day-to-day basis?
Absolutely. So my role is really thinking about what's next for TD when it comes to sustainability. So I have the pleasure of working with all of our different business segments across North America, from our large wholesale clients to retail clients, insurance, asset management, wealth management, and really trying to think about how we can integrate sustainability into our offerings. And obviously, alongside that comes different opportunities as we think towards net zero by 2050. And there's a lot of capital at play. When you look at recent numbers from the federal government in Canada anyway, $125 to $140 billion per year is needed to reach net zero emissions by 2050 in Canada alone. And that really signals a really big opportunity. And when I think of my team, we're really focused on, again, how do we identify, assess, and ultimately execute on some of these opportunities. helping support our clients at the end of the day, of course.
And so you say that you spearhead the $500 billion sustainable and decarbonization finance target, right? And you also led previously the TD Sustainable Bonds program with several $100 million aimed, as you say, at projects that promote climate change mitigation, adaptation, and more broadly, the net zero targets, right? And so these efforts also led to winning the Environmental Finance's Green Bond of the Year in 2024. So could you speak either to these efforts specifically or the sector more generally as to what goes on behind the scenes, right? What are the main, let's say, challenges or what motivates an organization towards these goals? And related to this, I suppose, as an insider, so I'm an academic, I'm not in finance, but an academic debate that goes on is this conflicting evidence over whether green funds yield higher returns, higher financial returns, right? So is there an alignment between the environmental performance and financial performance? Now, how do you view this debate as an insider? So is there a green premium, and how are these conflicts resolved internally?
It's a very packed question. Let me try to dissect it a little bit. So TD has really a long history in this space, so it really predates my time at the bank. We were the first Canadian commercial bank to issue a green bond in 2014. Subsequently, in 2017, we launched a $100 billion low carbon economy target, which was focused on supporting the transition to a lower carbon economy, which we actually achieved in 2022. Subsequently, we set the $500 billion by 2030 target, which I had the pleasure of working on with many partners across TD. That being said, there's a lot of different initiatives at play that's helping not only TD, but other financial institutions and other players in the market, move towards a lower carbon economy. But really what's important at the end of the day is how we help support our clients navigate their own climate journeys. Banking at its core is all about relationships and how you nurture those relationships to help support your clients achieve their objectives. When it comes to the topic of the greenium, which I think you're talking about, the potential benefits of sustainability, when you think of it like from a markets dynamic perspective anyway, it's all about supply and demand. Right now, there's very little supply in terms of the eligible projects that are available to invest. And naturally, economics always holds true. That causes a pricing benefit at the end of the day. So I do think that there is empirical evidence to prove that there are pricing benefits associated. The way, shape, and form obviously varies by industry, it varies by issuer, but there is a lot of benefits. And at its core, when you think about the benefits of sustainability beyond the more softer elements around reputation and brand and connecting with your customers and clients and that credibility angle, there's also strong risk mitigation techniques, right? So when you're better adapting your organization to address some of the challenges that you are faced and the risks that come alongside that, you are better equipping your organization for the longevity. So there's a lot of different initiatives and tools that we can potentially dive in if you like, Sanjith. But it's really an interesting time to be in this space. And even over the past 5 years, I've noticed such a big shift in the mindset around sustainability ESG from being a nice to have to almost a necessity at its core.
And again, from your perspective, how reliable do you think these disclosures by firms are? Because I assume that they have to carry some weight in how you evaluate these firms. And at what stage of this journey do you think they are in terms of having reliable environmental and maybe even more broadly ESG data? And do you think it's comparable to the reliability of the financial data they put out?
Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting time when it comes to the sustainability disclosure environment. And at the end of the day, my focus is really on sustainable finance, but happy to share some initial perspectives. So, for the longest part, it's been voluntary disclosure. But increasingly what we're seeing globally, whether it's through the International Sustainability Standards Board or different regulators within Canada and the US and Europe, they're coming up with more stringent standards to, exactly your point, Sanjith, to drive that comparability and consistency and accuracy and timeliness of reporting. And again, that speaks to more so of how do you properly think about the risks that are associated with these opportunities. Consistent disclosure is helpful for financial decision makers to make informed decisions at the end of the day. So, we're seeing a more shift, again, away from voluntary disclosure to mandated regulatory disclosure, at least in Canada.
Interesting. The reason I ask this is because from a firm's perspective, when you ask a firm as to what motivates its ESG goals, they primarily identify, I would say, three drivers, right? They would say, well, there's maybe some consumer pressure. There are some consumers who demand firms to be more sustainable. Then there's regulatory pressure to the extent that there are regulations, firms have to respond to them. But the big piece that a lot of them point to is investor pressure, right? Is that they say, well, our investors make demands of us or would like to see us be more sustainable. And I guess that's where my question to you, which was, well, then what motivates, let's say, TD or more generally the financial sector to themselves move towards sustainability, but also demand of the firms that are, let's say, raising capital to be more sustainable? What would you identify as an underlying primary driver there?
Yeah, so I think for me anyway, my perspective is that sustainability disclosures, similar to financial disclosure, like when you think about the history of these topics, like prior to the financial crisis in the 1930s, the Securities and Exchange Commission never existed, so there was not standardized reporting. I think what's happening now, at least in the sustainability world, is kind of like a repeat of that cycle. So you're seeing enhanced comparability and focus on that to provide decision useful information to a wide range of stakeholders. When you think of sustainability as a whole, you have different stakeholder groups. Of course, you have investors, you have non-governmental organizations, variety of employees of organizations, clients. All of these users of this report, it makes it challenging to create a report that addresses the needs of all these different stakeholders. So I think what we're seeing on the mandatory side anyway is more towards financially relevant sustainability information to drive decision useful information. From the sustainability reporting side, you're seeing, again, to that point on how do you convey with a broader group of stakeholders, as well as drive that credibility. So when I think of like this space, because of the lack of regulation and given it's voluntary, what you're seeing is a wide array of information being provided, and sometimes that's challenging to compare.
You're right, and essentially to sort of move back to sustainable finance, if you look at sustainability reporting and you talk to folks in the space, they point to certain solutions that would make their life easier, right? So they would say, well, if you're preparing a report or if you're interpreting a report, how do you make two different reports from different firms comparable, right? And so they would try to point to technological solutions, and there are lots of startups that are trying to address this question. Now, in your space in sustainable finance, what do you think are firstly some of the challenges that you see on a day-to-day basis? And what are maybe some of the tools to help solve some of these bigger challenges in sustainable finance? And what solutions, these could be technological or otherwise, that would make your life easier if they existed?
For sure. I'll try to keep myself reined in. I could talk about this stuff quite in depth. Yeah. So from my point of view, Sanjith, when I think of the tools in the toolkit and the challenges that they're trying to attempt to solve, a few come to mind. So for me, it's all about how do you unlock opportunities in this space. So when you think of some of the tools, one that comes to mind immediately is a transition or green taxonomy in Canada. There is a need for common definitions around what constitutes green and sustainable and transition-related activities. Without that, you don't have investor confidence in the market to invest. So when you think of, for example, the bond market, green bonds were far and few between many, many years ago. The rise of the issuance of green bonds at its infancy, drove incomparability between bond issuances. What was included? What was the underlying projects that were actually being allocated to at the end of the day? We've advanced quite significantly in that space, and that's thanks to the International Capital Markets Association that has guidelines and principles that clearly articulate what constitutes green and social. On the transition side, it's much more nuanced. When you think of transition-related activities, it's very regional. The transition for Canada's economy looks much different than it does in Europe, and that stems back to the economic makeup that makes our economy unique. And that gives that flexibility for interpretation on what constitutes transition. So, one of the tools that the government is currently looking to solve for is the establishment of a voluntary green and transition taxonomy that's been in the works for several years now, but we just recently got an update in October that we could expect the first few sectors, they do it by sector approach, on what would constitute green and transition. So I'm very optimistic about this tool because it's going to enable the capital markets to be confidently raising capital in these different domains that mitigates the potential concerns around greenwashing. The other tool that comes to mind for me is about blended finance. So as I was mentioning, there's $125 to $140 billion per year up until 2050 on the table for not only financial institutions, but also all market players. That being said, banks are not the one and only solution to helping us solve some of these bigger challenges. It's going to take everyone. When I look at my team within the bank, I have a variety of different skill sets at the table. Not everyone's based in finance. We have lots of engineers. We have people from political science, communication. So I think it really is important to have that diverse perspective going into here. And that being said, when we think about the financing of these activities that are going to help us unlock net zero by 2050, it's important to say that governments play a role and blended capital. So essentially, you can help mitigate some of the risk that's associated with some of these projects by blending in public or philanthropic funds. And you see a lot of really interesting institutions in Canada being stood up, namely like the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, which is looking to partner with organizations to help unlock these different opportunities where private capital will play a role. So I think blended finance techniques is also a really critical tool in addition to a transition taxonomy. And the last thing maybe I'll touch on is risk mitigation techniques. So it's really important that we think about how we can adapt to a changing climate. And that includes things like addressing fiscal and transition risks. So having clear ways to be able to, one, articulate what those look like and embed them into strategy is really critical when you think of sustainable finance in Canada.
Interesting. So I want to go back to the first point you raised on having a green taxonomy of transition projects, let's say. So let's talk about something concrete to ensure we are on the same page. So let's say in Canada, in British Columbia, there's a new LNG project, right? Now, a natural gas project, natural gas is a fossil fuel at the end of the day, but I suppose an argument can be made that this can be a transition fuel, right? Because maybe there are parts in Asia, maybe let's say China or India, where coal is being used, and to the extent that you export natural gas to these markets, it serves as a transition fuel, right? Now, but it's not so clear. Again, this is just one side of the argument, and you will have others who are critics of this, naturally. Now, is your point that, well, this question needs to be resolved one way or the other, and then there are several such questions across various sectors?
Mm-hmm. That's a really great follow-up question, Sanjith, and I appreciate it. I think there's a lot of nuance when it comes to the different sectors and the various approaches at the end of the day. When you look at different scenarios that will enable us to get to net zero by 2050, for example, the International Energy Agency clearly says no new oil or gas. And there's other different taxonomies out there, to your point, that may include some fossil fuel-based activities in their taxonomy. So you could think of different regions in emerging markets that include them in their taxonomies that have a developed one. But I think we need that clarity on what it means for Canada. And it's not for, Mitch to decide what should be considered transition. To your point, though, there may be certain criteria or qualifiers that need to go into play to enable sure that it's a credible transition at the end of the day. And that's what we would expect to hopefully see in a taxonomy and preventing fossil fuel lock-in. So, maybe a different example is something that we have a little bit more agreeance on could be renewables, right? So we know things like hydro, wind, solar are some of the key technologies that are going to help us enable to get us to net zero. Hydro is very nuanced in itself too. When you think of large scale versus small scale hydro and the potential externalities that come from certain projects. But at the end of the day, these taxonomies will help answer some of these questions and drive consensus in the market and a common understanding of what people are buying, which will ultimately allow the market to hopefully take off.
Excellent. And so relating to your other two solutions or challenges that you wish there were solutions for, again, maybe this is a bit outside your wheelhouse, but from your experience, where do you think the challenges are when you compare the political versus the technological, right? To what extent are the problems the fact that we don't have sufficient maybe policy levers in place or policies or regulations in place to aid you versus how much of it is, well, maybe the technology is not yet out there or is not yet scalable enough?
Right. So again, my focus is really on my work, which is centered on sustainable finance. But I think having clear and consistent policies will enable us to unlock these opportunities. When you think of certainty, people like regulatory certainty in the market. So I think as a general kind of preface, having policies that give investors that longer term view will ultimately attract capital at the end of the day. So when you think of the renewables space, having clear and consistent policies around renewables, or you think about incentives around EVs, like things like you and I may drive, having clear policy signals to consumers that you have a tax credit that is going to survive longevity generally is a helpful tool from the policy side. And I think at the end of the day, though, it's about that 125 to 140 billion per year. If we focus in on that, having a policy landscape that is conducive of enabling these types of activities is ultimately going to allow organizations in the economy to effectively move closer towards net zero by 2050.
So switching things up a bit, let's go back to your journey in this space. And as you mentioned, you're an alumnus of McGill, of the MMF program, the Masters of Management in Finance. And so looking back now, it's been a few years, I guess. How do you view the MMF program, and how did it help you in your career, or how did it sort of shape the direction in which you went forth?
For sure. As you mentioned on the onset, I am a super proud McGill alumnus. I really appreciate the network that McGill has, created. It was funny, I'll maybe go on a side tangent and then I'll come back to actually answer the question that you asked, Sanjith. So during my trip, the MMF program has an international trip, and mine was to New York. That's where I pitched the socially responsible investing fund at the consulate in New York. And I ended up meeting one of the McGill alumni that worked at one of the big investment banks. And, really interesting guy. His focus was on sustainable capital markets. And fast forward a few years later, I ended up working closely with him on one of TD's green bond issuances. So it's a very small world, and he actually remembered me. He's like, oh yeah, like you were the one that was super interested in sustainability. I was like, yes, that's me. But I think McGill offers a really, really great platform to be able to connect with alumni, and events like this is just proof in point. For the MMF in particular, I really loved the balance between the hands-on experience in Desautels capital management as well as the theoretical side. That's ultimately what really attracted me to the program at the end of the day. And the fact that, when I was looking for graduate level education, there wasn't that many programs at the time that offered a focus on sustainable finance. I was definitely that annoying student that asked professors about the intersection between finance and sustainability. And now there's actually a dedicated course on sustainable finance offered in the MMF program. So I'm really keen that that's in place. Since then, I think our network at the MMF program and also just more generally has really expanded. Like I work with a lot of McGill grads and alumni. And you just imagine the common connection that comes to place. Like, everyone has really fond memories of living in Montreal, their experiences at McGill. So yeah, it's really, really nice at the end of the day to see that presence, not only within Canada, but also in the US and more globally.
Excellent. And on that note, do you have any advice or tips or, what advice would you offer either current MMF students or prospective MMF students or even advanced, let's say, undergraduate students who are either interested in sustainable finance specifically, or let's say they have a broader interest in sustainability and are looking to bring that interest or passion to their day jobs, right? So what would be your suggestion to them, or how should they go about this?
Right. Maybe I'll start with the advice piece. I have the pleasure of working with really, really brilliant colleagues on this file. And trust me, there is no right path to get to net zero. There isn't a playbook that, we need to follow. So, when I think of the characteristics and the qualities of my colleagues that I have the chance to work with, three things really come to mind. One, being able to deal with ambiguity. This space is constantly evolving. So when we're talking about the shift, just for example, from voluntary to regulatory reporting, that's just happened really in the last maybe 12 months or so that we've started to see regulation that comes into play. And you can just imagine on like the different facets of it, like when you think about a transition taxonomy, when you think about other tools in the toolkit to unlock that 140 billion per year. So people generally that are very comfortable in ambiguous environments tend to do very, very well. That comes with a big caveat though. That comes with a lot of information. You need to filter through the fire hose. Like sometimes it feels like when I look at my inbox, like I have 50 different things from 50 different directions that we could take. And I think that really speaks to the maturity of the opportunities that exist. So being able to structure information in a way that makes sense to people and that can drive tangible actions and driving that uncommon connection is really, really key. So I would say structuring materials and making very beautiful slides is a prerequisite for banking. And the third piece is really effective communication, both verbally and written. When I see really strong people, if they can't convey the really complex ideas in a way that makes sense to executives or clients, it's not going to take it that far. So how do you simplify ideas and communicate it in a way that resonates with people, but also you can go into the nitty-gritty to say, like, with the technical experts in this space. And lastly, just something I would add on top for consideration is just being curious. Like, I, by trade, don't have any technical experience in sustainability. Like, my formal training is both in finance. My undergrad's in finance. My master's is in finance. But I'm self-taught. And I think people who want to enter into this space, you don't need to have an engineering or a science background to be able to help contribute to some of these big solutions. We need different perspectives from all sides of the table. And that's ultimately how we're going to move forward to a more sustainable future.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mitch. Maybe we can take some questions from the audience. Yep, please go ahead.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Maybe we'll have Daniel's question. We'll come to you second.
Yeah. So I guess just starting off, first off, thanks for speaking here. Secondly, when it comes to green funds, is that like more a focus on companies specifically dealing in sustainable initiatives, or is it also kind of an incentive for existing companies to shift their policies or ways to become more sustainable?
That's a great question, and I appreciate it. When you look at different funds that have a sustainability angle to it, it's really important that you look at the underlying methodology that drives it. So when you think of like a different agency, whether it be Sustainalytics, their assessment is primarily based off of how well is this company addressing the material, environmental and social risks that are faced to its organization. So things that looks like, is there a plan in place? How are they actually mitigated or managed those different risks? And essentially the gap between their perception on a company's E&S risk profile and how well they're managing it results in a certain score. Those scores are aggregated across industries, and there's a lot of nuances and technical stuff that goes behind the scenes to deriving them. But it gives you a list. And what you can see across that list is like every company has a really important role to play to addressing sustainability risks and how effectively they are at managing them. But it's a good question, right? So, when you think about the different types of funds, so that's one end of it, is just basic ESG screening for risk. On the other side, you have more impact-oriented funds, and those are really focused at greenfield projects, maybe in aggregate or by company level, depends on the type of fund that you're investing in. And those are dedicated specifically maybe to projects that are trying to pursue a certain outcome, whether it's like building more renewables or building battery storage or hydrogen or whatever it may be, the technology. But I'm really encouraged to see that there are a variety of different ways individuals like you and I or corporations could play a role in helping, be part of the bigger solution at the end of the day.
Yeah, just following up on that question. So with, I guess with these type of funds, with those kind of, incentives of, TD creating these funds, does that, has that shown to affect corporations and how they're actually behaving in regards to sustainability? And if so, how does TD kind of weed out greenwashing and kind of see firsthand what's going on, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I do think that there is a strong incentive when you have these different dedicated projects. But maybe I'll preface with, it's really important to take a balanced approach in meeting the sustainability needs of today, but also matching that with tomorrow. There's, again, not one right or wrong way to get to net zero by 2050. And I think what's really, key at the end of the day is how you apply whatever the methodology is by sector. It really depends. When you think of the nuances that come along different sectors and trying to meet clients where they're at and helping them advance their own goals, it's, again, very, very nuanced. And I think our approach, again, has always been focused on furthering our relationships with our clients and encouraging them where it makes sense align with their own sustainability plans. There are different tools in our toolkit. I think the one that you're referencing on the Green Fund is more from like an investment standpoint. But I'll give you another concrete tool. For example, sustainability-linked loans or bonds is a very interesting tool. So maybe I'll compare and contrast that. We talked about it earlier, use of proceed types instruments like green, social, or sustainability bonds, but there are sustainability-linked bonds. And what does that mean in comparison? With the use of proceeds, you're allocating funds directly to a specific project. Call it a renewable energy, wind farm, whatever it may be. With the sustainability-linked side, you're actually tying that to an entity's corporate level sustainability strategy. So maybe it's on emissions reduction on scope 1 and 2. Maybe it's on worker safety. Again, the nuances depend on the industry, and there's consistency and the guidance out there from the LSTA on how to define those. But essentially, the sustainability-linked part is if the client meets certain goals that they've agreed to in advance of entering in this agreement with us, we'll give them a discount on their rate that they pay for the loan. So that encourages positively from a financial point of view, and it creates the incentives for them to advance it, in addition to doing that. But at the end of the day, it's all about progress and making sure that clients set plans that make sense for them, and they progress against them in a way that is clear and transparent.
Well, yeah, I think that really clears things up a lot. Thanks.
Cool.
Thank you. So I think we had a question here, and then I'll come over. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the fire chat. And I think my question is directly linked to something you already alluded earlier for scope 1 and 2. So on one hand, we want to be able to motivate the corporation to have better strategy. So that means value chain, which is lead to the idea of scope 3. But the other hand, scope 3 itself is kind of double counting, right? Because essentially you have the supplier and a demander, but then they count it twice. So how do you resolve the problem of be able to calculate the carbon emission zero sum in a more accurate way, but also incentivize them to improve their value chain?
It's a fantastic question. I am very fortunate at TD that I don't need to solve that problem. I have a very smart team of people that I get to work very closely with that actually measures the emissions, whether it be scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. I can speak to more generally if it's helpful. There are some prevailing methodologies, and you'll have to be patient with me because again, I'm not the expert in carbon accounting. So when you think of scope 1 or scope 2, those are related to, for example, a company's physical emissions. Speaking of like a financial institution, there's branches, there's corporate offices, electricity consumption, etc., heating and cooling as well. And when you think of like scope 3 emissions, that's primarily for a financial institution of any sorts. Those are like the investments or the loans that a company gives. So if you lend $100 million to a $1 billion company, you attribute 10% of that company's emissions back to you. And that's the problem that financial institutions are trying to solve, and that obviously varies by asset class. I would encourage you to look at the Principles for Carbon Accounting Financials. I think it's PCAF, that's what it's called. And that's generally the prevailing methodology that organizations are considering in the financial world on how to account for scope 3 and avoid double counting, to your point. But inevitably, there's lots of challenges with scope 3 emissions, whether you talked about double counting, but also data and quality of information is also very challenging in that space. But what's really important at the end of the day is you have the right incentives to track, manage, and ultimately try to reduce those amount of emissions as much as possible. When you think of like sustainable finance in the intersection between the two, you could think of it as kind of like, unless you're a greenfield project, every company is kind of experiencing transition to some way, shape, or form, whether it be on the risk side or on the opportunity side. McGill as an institution, right? So, it's not immune to transition risk. You might think that's a little bit odd. Well, there's facilities like this for scope 1 and scope 2. There's purchases through their supply chain, to your point. So McGill in itself is actually undergoing a transition as well as we move towards net zero. And every player in the economy has an important role to play in doing that. Financial institutions are obviously the heartline of our economy and play a critical role in helping facilitate the capital towards these different projects.
Thank you so much. That's very thorough.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed your presentation. I was wondering whether Toronto Dominion imposes some sort of hierarchy associated with the specific sustainable development goals. Is there a particular weighting that appears, or is it really done on a case-by-case basis? And as a segue, my impression, based on your presentation, is that Toronto Dominion is emphasizing local development projects. It's true that certain corporations, definitely on the supply side, would have multinational elements. But I was wondering whether there is a segment of your green bonds and also your investment funds that focuses on fostering international cooperation and harmonizing the activities of different countries, not only the allies, but also in some cases those relationships have to be fostered with the nemesis as well, even in times of war and conflict. So I was wondering whether there is much attention to that, even in trying times, to find harmony and to find ways to better distribute cap and trade policies. Thank you.
Great question. So when I think it comes to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, they're a really great way to articulate sustainability ambitions by 2030. And you look at some of our prevailing frameworks at the bank, and they're mapped to, and same with every other player in the market. There is a detailed mapping. And I think oftentimes we speak slightly different languages, but there is, again, that mapping exercise that occurs. So when you think of the International Capital Markets Association, and then I'll maybe stem into the bond question, what ICMA does really, really well is they do the mapping of how their different use of proceeds categories, whether it be renewable energy, green buildings, affordable housing on the social side, map to those different sustainable development goals and their contributions, and how organizations, financial institutions, should be thinking about allocating to different projects and their relative impacts. Hopefully that gives a little bit of color into that question. There isn't necessarily a hierarchy in terms of need. I think, what's really interesting is, on the climate side anyway, it's going to cost a lot of money. And right now, we're at a very important time where global cooperation around climate is certainly really, really key. And driving, to your point, that harmonization of a common goal and getting capital to places that need it the most is really, really important. I want to underscore that. For my work at the bank, it's primarily focused on North America, given our footprint is in Canada and the US. But there are a few international projects that we do engage in from time to time. But again, it's more from a Canada-US perspective. But hopefully that answers the question.
It does. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, we have. Yeah.
Thank you for coming. My question is, do you know any project nowadays trying to reduce consumption of oil? More specifically, instead of busing, a lot of students go to the West Island using online education.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Okay.
I understand.
I see a lot of McGill students going to West Island by bus.
Oh, okay.
Busing the student go to
understand.
bus. Instead of going to West Island to John Albert College using online education. Do you see any project helping to transition from online education?
I appreciate the question, yeah. So when we think about transformation and education and infrastructure, you can tell my brain has to do a lot of gymnastics from sector to sector. I think it's really critical when you think of that particular example, like the benefits and the challenges that are associated with being educated online. I think there's a lot of really great learnings that we had from the pandemic, and that's a really nice silver lining of how do people work remotely. I have the pleasure of working remotely for my job most of the time. But to your point, there are certain externalities that come as a result of certain economic activity. In this instance, it's the transportation of and movement of people to a certain location for a specific purpose. I can't speak to the specifics. I've never actually been to the John Abbott campus, I must admit, even though I am a proud alumni. But from my understanding, the agriculture work is there. So I think it's really dependent on the skill sets that you need to do, and if there's an option to offer an online setting, there's obviously benefit. Speaking a little bit adjacent to your question, on the modes of sustainable transportation, I think it is really important to think about, and be conscious of the different aspects that we use. A lot of people use internal combustion engine vehicles to drive themselves places, and internal combustion engine would also include public or semi-public transportation like buses and other sporting infrastructure. We're seeing lots of innovations in this space, and I think the light rail in Montreal is a really good example of that, and the potential benefits of allowing people to commute in a more sustainable way via electricity, which in Quebec is almost 100% hydropower. So I think I'm really encouraged by the future, but it is a good point on there are opportunities to encourage people to choose different options that could be potentially more sustainable. But you also need to balance that with the in-person experience and the challenges associated with it at the end of the day.
I'll get to the 3 people who already raised their hand, but afterwards there is networking, so if you have extra questions, you're welcome to ask.
Thank you for your presentation. When TD Bank or any bank finances a project or loans out money for a sustainable project, of course you expect to get your money back. Now recently there have been, I think, a lot of companies in that field that have gone bankrupt. So has any of TD's loans been defaulted on, or any bank that you know of loans been defaulted on?
That's a good question. I think at the end of the day, when you think about credit risk assessments, you're talking about the intersection between creditworthiness and risk and the sustainability outcomes. Credit risk is fundamentally, like you think of a bank as a big risk manager, right? We're managing and mitigating certain risks, including credit risk, reputational risk, strategic risk, a whole bunch of different risk categories. So there isn't any specific, projects that come to mind, to be honest with you. But generally speaking, a role of a financial institution is to identify projects that have a strong viability and associatedly, price that risk accordingly, depending on how much it is, and ultimately enter into that engagement. And that's just consistent across the board, just, generally speaking, whether it's a sustainable project or not. But yeah, it's a good question. I haven't seen any, particular nuances or instances where certain projects have, not been as successful as others.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. So I was wondering, how do you think the Canadian fixed income market relates to the rest of the world in terms of sustainability? And although the Canadian fixed income market is kind of limited in respect to other fixed income markets internationally, I wonder if it provides a good ground for also the innovation and creation of new securities for this purpose.
That's a great question. So when you think of the fixed income market, obviously super important market to help get capital to the places that need it and certain projects that need it at the end of the day. I think when you think of innovation in finance, there hasn't been a lot of innovation in the financial services space for quite some time. And I think sustainability is one of those areas that does offer the opportunity to attract more capital into the Canadian market, particularly when you have a clear and consistent guidelines that give investors confidence to know what they're investing in is certainly a critical element, at least of the green and transition taxonomy, and the premise on why there's a really strong focus on it. To one of the previous comments, stemming to that helps get really good clarity on what's in and what's out, and that's ultimately going to mitigate the perceptions of what greenwashing is at the end of the day. Roughly, just trying to do this in my head, like 140 billion per year, let's call it roughly 30% of that's going to come from the financial services sector-ish, 30 to 50%. That's obviously dependent on the sector. That's quite a sum of capital that's going to be required to get us there. So I think, the fixed income market's going to have a really critical role to play. But yeah, at the end of the day, you have multiple sources of capital, whether it be balance sheet, institutional investors, debt capital markets, or just plain old lending to help us get us there at the end of the day. But nonetheless, fixed income is a super critical market to unlocking some of these opportunities.
Thank you. We have time for one last question.
Super good question. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to listen to. I also work in ESG and sustainability, so it's great to hear from a colleague. My question is related to the regulations in the sustainability and sustainable finance space. As we know, regulations impact a lot sustainability and how everything about the green taxonomy and the whole jargon of sustainability. Regarding the current and what happened in the political landscape, I'm just wondering, how do you forecast the l'apport en financement into the Canadian market, into sustainable finance, if that makes sense, my question.
Yeah, I understand the question. And I appreciate the question. I think it's a super valuable one. I think the science is really clear, right? However we want to phrase it, there is no plan B. There is an important way to get us to net zero by 2050 at the end of the day. And that's putting politics aside. This is what the science is telling us, and let's stick to the fact and not stick to opinion. How we get there at the end of the day is, to Sanjith's question, is having clear and consistent policies. This is really important at the end of the day, whether it's a transition taxonomy. But I really remain optimistic. It's now more than ever that we need to come together to help advance this work. I view part of my role in the broader sphere of things helping to help drive that change. And I view everyone here also playing a critical role in that space. And all of the students at McGill as well. Really every sector and every aspect of our society is going to have a really critical role to play at the end of the day. Whether you work in finance or not, I think everyone is going to eventually someday feel the implications of what climate change has. So, if not now, when is the question in my mind.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mitch. Thank you for being generous with your time and your expertise. I'd also like to conclude by once again thanking our team at SGI, Ashley and Carolyn, as well as the team at Alumni Engagement, Ireland and Lynn, without whom this event would not have been possible. And thank you also to all the supporters of SGI, CIBC, Alstom, CDPQ, and Power Sustainable. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. Those of you who are joining us in person, please feel free to stay back and help yourself to some refreshments. And Mitch will also be around for some time, so any other questions, feel free to have them offline. Thank you all very much, and thank you for joining us.